In a quiet small town, wrapped in the chill of late autumn, bare branches scratching against the gray sky. Inside one modest home, a little girl balances trembling hands on heavy dishes, while laughter and praise fall only on her brother. A stumble, a fall, and silence, until the sharp bark of a German shepherd shatters the air. In that moment, a bond is born that will change everything. Before we begin this story, I'd love to know, where are you watching from right now? Leave a comment below, and may your day be filled with warmth, hope, and gentle blessings. The town of Pine Brook rested quietly at the edge of the Blue Cedar Mountains, a place where winter always arrived early and stayed longer than anyone wished. By late November, the sky was already the color of ash, and the last leaves clung stubbornly to skeletal branches that scratched against the wind. Smoke rose from narrow chimneys in wavering threads, filling the streets with the sharp scent of burning oak. The houses, built decades ago for lumber workers and their families, lined the narrow streets like weary soldiers waiting for orders. On Cedar Lane, a modest brown-shingled house leaned slightly to one side, its windows glowing faintly against the encroaching dusk. Inside that house sat the Briggs family, each member bound by blood but divided by something far colder than the snow drifting against the window panes. Howard Briggs, 45, was the head of the household, a man who once commanded respect in Pine Brook for his hard work at the sawmill. He was tall and broad-shouldered, the years of hauling lumber giving him the kind of physical strength that seemed carved from iron. His face was sharp and weathered, with lines etched deep into his forehead and pale gray eyes that looked as though they were carved from stone. He wore his authority like a second skin, demanding obedience in his home, just as he once demanded productivity from the workers he supervised. To neighbors, Howard was known as efficient, punctual, and strict. But behind his closed door, his expectations cut deeper, especially toward his children. He had grown up under a father who believed kindness was weakness, and he carried that belief into every corner of his own home. Ethan Briggs, Howard's eldest son, was 10 years old and the pride of his father's eye. Ethan had a wiry build, long limbs that seemed made for running, and a face that still held the roundness of boyhood, but with the beginnings of sharpness around the jaw. His dark brown hair stuck up messily, no matter how much his grandmother scolded him to comb it, and his quick smile was often paired with a cocky tilt of the chin. Ethan thrived on attention, particularly from Howard, and his confidence bloomed in the warmth of his father's praise. He had already built a reputation at school as a fast runner and a loud talker, someone who knew his father would defend him no matter what. With that knowledge, Ethan wore arrogance like armor. Clara Mae Briggs, the youngest at 7 years old, was a stark contrast to her brother. Small for her age, she had a delicate frame that was often hidden beneath sweaters 2 sizes too large, hand-me-downs from Ethan that sagged at her shoulders and trailed past her wrists. Her hair, pale blonde, slipped from the loose braids she tied herself, and her eyes, an icy blue, were too serious for her age, as though they carried burdens far older than her years. She had inherited a softness from her late mother, a gentleness that seemed out of place in Howard's rigid house. Clara had learned to sit quietly, to lower her gaze, and to make herself as invisible as possible. To speak too much was to invite criticism, and to falter was to be mocked. She carried her silence like a shield, but it left her lonelier than she knew how to bear. That evening, the kitchen glowed beneath the light of a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. A pot of stew simmered on the stove, filling the air with the scent of chicken and thyme. Howard sat at the head of the table, his flannel shirt stretched across his shoulders, his rough hands resting on the wood like anchors. Ethan lounged to his right, his knees still smudged with the dirt from soccer practice, bragging about the goal he had scored earlier that afternoon. Clara sat on the edge of her chair, spoon in hand, staring down at the rising steam from her bowl. The warmth fogged her glasses and blurred her reflection, giving her a ghostly image of herself. Howard leaned toward Ethan, his voice gruff but proud. "That's my boy. Discipline, determination, that's what makes a man. Keep it up, and you'll be the best on the team." Ethan's grin widened, soaking up the praise as though it were sunlight. Clara opened her mouth slightly, ready to mention that her teacher had given her a gold star for neat handwriting that day, but the words caught in her throat. She had seen the look on her father's face before, the dismissive glance that silenced her more effectively than any shout. She closed her lips, swallowing both soup and words. When she reached to refill her father's bowl, her small hands trembled. The ladle slipped, spilling hot broth across the table. Howard's chair scraped harshly against the floor as he shoved it back. "For God's sake, Clara," he barked, his voice a sharp whip against her ears. "Steady hands. You're 7, not a baby." Clara's cheeks flushed crimson, and she grabbed a towel to blot the mess. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though her voice was barely audible. Ethan leaned back in his chair, laughter bubbling from his chest. "Maybe she needs a sippy cup," he teased, his tone crueler than playful. The sound struck Clara harder than the heat of the soup. She bent low, mopping the spill, desperate to erase the mistake. In her rush, the dish towel slipped from her waistband and tangled around her small feet. Her shoe skidded on the slick floor, and before she could regain balance, the corner of the oak table met her head with a sickening thud. The sound echoed in the room, followed by the sharp clatter of dishes crashing around her. Clara dropped to her knees, her vision exploding into flashes of white. For a moment, the world tilted, and she felt as though she were falling into a brightness she could not escape. Pain pulsed against her temple with each heartbeat, sharp and relentless. Ethan burst out laughing again, pointing as though it were a joke. "She made the bowls fly!" Howard stood over her, his face shadowed in disapproval rather than concern. "Now, what is it?" he demanded, his tone weary, as if her pain were merely an inconvenience. Clara pressed her small hand against her temple, feeling the heat and throb beneath her skin. "I slipped," she whispered, though her voice shook. Howard's hand, rough and calloused, gripped her elbow and yanked her back to her feet. "You're fine. Get up. Children need to toughen up, not wallow in pity." He released her with a firm shove toward the sink. Clara forced herself to smile crookedly, so that he would not accuse her of sulking. Her head pounded, her vision blurred at the edges, but she picked up the dishes and returned to her task. Ethan continued to smirk, balancing his chair on 2 legs, only to receive a half-hearted scolding from Howard. "Feet down," Howard said, though there was warmth in his tone, a playful sharpness that never extended to Clara. Dinner ended with Howard praising Ethan once more for his grit, and the two of them retired to the living room to watch television. Clara remained behind, washing dishes with trembling hands, the warm water stinging her scraped knuckles. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through her skull, but she stayed silent, letting the sound of the water mask her quiet gasps. Later that night, she stepped outside to throw the trash. The cold November air cut against her cheeks, and the stars flickered faintly above the roofs of Pinebrook. In the distance, she heard the deep bark of a dog echoing across the street, a sound that startled her, but also soothed her in a way she could not explain. For a fleeting moment, she imagined a German shepherd standing beside her, protective and unyielding, keeping her safe from the shadows that seemed to close in. Back in her room, she curled beneath her thin quilt, pulling it tightly around her fragile frame. The bruise at her temple throbbed with a secret pain, and tears pricked at her eyes, though none fell. She had already learned the rules of her house. Weakness was not allowed, and so she lay silently, the house creaking into stillness, while Pinebrook exhaled under the gray sky, and a little girl tried to fall asleep, her world tilted and uncertain. Morning in Pinebrook broke without ceremony. The sky was the same dull gray as the night before, only lighter, and a brittle wind rattled the loose shutters of the Briggs home. Inside, the smell of bitter coffee filled the kitchen, drifting up the staircase to where Clara May woke reluctantly in her narrow bed. Her head still throbbed where it had struck the table, a deep ache that seemed stitched into her skull, but she dressed quietly in her navy school sweater, its sleeves sagging past her wrists. At the table, Howard Briggs was already seated, his back ramrod straight, a newspaper folded into neat columns in front of him. His flannel shirt was buttoned tightly, sleeves rolled up, as if ready for battle with the day. His pale gray eyes scanned the headlines, lips pressed thin, a man who measured silence as though it were discipline. Across from him, Ethan tore into a plate of toast with the careless appetite of a boy who knew he was adored. His cheeks still flushed from the cold air outside, where he had run to fetch the morning paper, his dark brown hair sticking out at odd angles. He wore yesterday's victory like a medal, and every crunch of his toast was another reminder to Clara that his place in their father's eyes was secure. Clara lowered herself into her chair, careful not to let the wood scrape against the floor. She poured herself a small bowl of cereal, the clink of the spoon sounding like a hammer in her aching head. Howard looked up once, his pale eyes narrowing. "Don't start acting sick," he said. "You've got school, no excuses." His words dropped like stones. Clara nodded silently, the spoon trembling in her hand. Ethan smirked, stretching out his legs under the table. "She just wants to skip chores," he muttered. His tone carried the smug confidence of someone who knew he could say anything without consequence. Howard folded his paper with military precision. "Ethan has practice after school, so you'll help with his chores, Clara. Laundry by noon, floors swept by the time I'm home." He took a long sip of coffee and did not glance at her again. Clara's stomach twisted, but she swallowed the cold cereal anyway, each bite tasting like cardboard. By afternoon, the sun broke weakly through the clouds, throwing a pale light across the Briggs' backyard. Clara carried a heavy basket of damp clothes, the cotton cold against her small arms. Her fingers, reddened by the chill, fumbled with each clothespin as she hung the garments on the line. The world tilted slightly when she bent forward, the bruise at her temple pulsing. On the porch, Ethan leaned lazily against the railing, tossing a baseball into his glove with rhythmic thuds. His wiry frame slouched, his grin wide with satisfaction. "Don't drop the sheets again," he called. "Dad hates when they touch the dirt." Clara kept her eyes down, clipping another shirt, but the ground swayed beneath her. "Clumsy," Ethan muttered, tossing the ball higher, catching it with deliberate exaggeration. Clara bit the inside of her cheek, willing herself not to cry. Weakness was punished, and she had no strength left for punishment. It was then that she noticed the figure of a woman moving briskly along the sidewalk. Mrs. Adelaide Turner, their neighbor from 3 houses down, was in her late 50s, a woman with a round figure that seemed both sturdy and soft at once. Her silver hair was always pulled into a bun, and her pale face carried lines from years of squinting into the Pine Brook sun while tending her garden. She was known for her sharp tongue, but also for her relentless kindness, the kind that slipped beneath people's defenses before they realized it. Life had hardened her early. Her husband had died young in a logging accident, leaving her to raise 2 children on her own. That history left her with a deep mistrust of men like Howard, who ruled their homes with fists instead of compassion. "Clara!" Adelaide called, her voice carrying a warmth that contrasted the brittle air. Clara looked up quickly, startled, and nearly dropped a damp towel. Adelaide smiled faintly, adjusting the wicker basket on her hip. "Tell your daddy I've got fresh jam for him if he wants it. And you, sweet girl, don't be letting that cold wind bite you too hard." Clara nodded shyly, managing a small smile before Adelaide continued down the street. Ethan snorted. "She's just nosy. Dad says she talks too much." But Clara didn't care. For the briefest moment, someone had noticed her. Not her mistakes, not her clumsiness, but her existence. She tucked that moment away like a secret. By late afternoon, the air sharpened with a deeper chill. Howard had returned from the mill, his broad shoulders sagging slightly under fatigue, though his jaw remained clenched, as if exhaustion itself needed to be conquered. He spoke little during supper, directing his few words toward Ethan about the upcoming soccer game. Clara sat quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wanted to mention her teacher's praise, the gold star she had earned for her writing, but the words died in her throat. Praise in this house belonged to Ethan. She had learned that lesson too well. After dinner, Howard retreated to the living room, Ethan bounding after him. Clara remained behind again, washing dishes alone. The water was warm, but stung her scraped knuckles. She stared at her reflection in the dark kitchen window, a small face framed by pale hair, eyes too big for such a small frame. For a moment she imagined what it would be like to live in Mrs. Turner's home, where the air smelled of cinnamon bread and laughter drifted out with the smoke from the chimney. The thought was a fleeting comfort. Later that night, in the quiet of her room, Clara curled beneath her patchwork quilt. The bruise at her temple throbbed mercilessly, but she pressed her small hand against it, whispering to herself that she was fine. That was what her father expected after all. In the distance, the deep bark of a dog echoed again, steady and protective, cutting through the night like a promise. Clara closed her eyes, and for the first time all day, she let herself imagine that the bark belonged to a German shepherd who stood guard outside her window, a silent friend waiting in the shadows. And with that thought, she drifted into sleep, unaware that change was already moving toward her home, step by steady step. The town of Pinebrook woke to a brittle morning, the kind where the frost lay heavy on every roof and the air carried the metallic bite of oncoming snow. At the edge of Main Street, the police station stood like a square block of brick, its flag stiff in the wind, windows fogged from the heat inside. Officer Logan Carter pushed through the door, his boots clicking against the worn linoleum floor as he started another day of patrol. Logan Carter, 36, carried himself with the quiet steadiness of someone who had seen too much yet refused to be hardened by it. Tall and broad-shouldered, his build was solid, the kind that filled a doorway without him needing to say a word. His hair was dark, kept close cropped, though gray threads had begun to appear at his temples. A neatly trimmed beard framed a square jaw, and his eyes, a muted hazel, held the weight of both discipline and compassion. Before coming back to Pinebrook, Logan had served in the Marines, a tour overseas leaving him with scars that could not be seen. He seldom spoke of it, but those who knew him understood that the silence was born not of secrecy, but of reverence for lives lost. Despite the past, he carried himself with a calm dignity, the kind neighbors trusted instinctively. Beside him padded Ranger, his 6-year-old German shepherd, a striking animal with black and silver fur thick across his shoulders. Ranger was large, 80 pounds of disciplined muscle, and moved with the fluid grace of a seasoned athlete. His amber eyes were intelligent, always alert, and a faint scar across his muzzle spoke of the rigorous training sessions that had shaped him into both protector and companion. Though formidable in stature, Ranger carried a gentleness with children, as though he instinctively knew when to temper his strength. To Logan, the dog was more than a partner. He was family, forged through years of training, late-night patrols, and quiet company when words failed. As Logan stepped into the chill of the morning, his patrol car already idled near the curb. Officer Marlene Diaz, his colleague, leaned against her own vehicle sipping coffee from a chipped mug. Marlene was in her early 40s, tall and angular, her short-cropped blonde hair tucked beneath a navy cap. Her face was lean, marked with faint lines that came not from age alone, but from years of dealing with both criminals and neighbors who tested her patience. Despite her sharp demeanor, she was respected for her loyalty, an unflinching sense of justice. Marlene had grown up in Pinebrook and had known Logan since childhood. While he left for the Marines, she stayed, carrying the town's burdens long before he returned. "You're out early," she remarked, nodding at Ranger, who sat obediently by Logan's side, breath steaming in the cold. "Town's quiet," Logan replied, sliding into his car, "just making sure it stays that way." Marlene smirked faintly. "Quiet never lasts, not here." By mid-afternoon, Logan's patrol carried him toward the outer streets of Pinebrook, where the houses leaned older, their fences sagging, and yards showed more struggle than pride. Ranger rode in the back seat, alert, ears pricked forward as though attuned to things his human partner could not yet sense. The Briggs home came into view, its paint weathered, shutters hanging loose. Logan slowed as he spotted movement near the laundry line in the backyard. Clara Mae Briggs stood among the sagging clothesline, her small arms burdened with another heavy basket of damp laundry. Her pale hair hung in uneven braids, strands falling loose to brush against her cheeks. Even from the street, Logan noticed the way she swayed slightly on her feet, her face too pale for a child at play. Ethan lounged on the porch railing, tossing a baseball into the air and catching it with a lazy grin. The boy's wiry frame contrasted sharply with his sister's frailty, his laughter carrying across the yard. Ranger shifted suddenly, ears pricking, his body leaning toward the window. A low whine escaped him. Logan frowned, pulling the car to the curb. He opened the door, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots announcing his approach. Ranger padded beside him, the leash loose but steady, his tail held low in a friendly wag. Clara looked up, startled, her small hands freezing on the laundry line. Her blue eyes widened, then softened when they met Ranger's amber gaze. The dog pressed closer to the fence, his nose slipping between the slats, a soft whine rising from his throat. Tentatively, Clara reached out. Her fingers brushed his thick fur, and for a moment, something in her expression eased. She smiled, small, fleeting, but real. Logan watched carefully, his hazel eyes narrowing as he caught the faint shadow of a bruise beneath her pale hairline. His voice softened. "Hey there, sweetheart. You doing all right?" Clara's hand slipped back quickly, her eyes lowering. "Yes, sir," she murmured, barely above a whisper. From the porch, Ethan scoffed. "She's fine. She just acts sick to get out of chores." Logan's gaze lingered on Clara for a moment longer, reading the silence in her posture, the way she wrapped her arms around herself. He recognized the quiet of children who had learned that words were dangerous. Instead of pressing, he nodded politely toward Ethan. "Afternoon. Tell your dad I'll see him at the town meeting tomorrow." Ethan shrugged, uninterested, and returned to his game. Logan tugged Ranger's leash gently, but the dog looked back over his shoulder, amber eyes locked on Clara until the fence and house slipped out of sight. That evening, Logan stopped briefly at the Pine Brook Diner, a narrow building with checkered floors and red vinyl booths that always smelled faintly of coffee and bacon. The diner was owned by Mabel Johnson, a woman in her 60s with a wide frame and a booming laugh that filled the room. Mabel's dark hair was streaked with silver, and her round face carried the softness of someone who had spent decades feeding both bellies and hearts. She had lost her husband years earlier to illness, but instead of growing bitter, she had poured herself into the diner, making it a sanctuary for locals and strangers alike. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Mabel said, as she slid a steaming plate of stew in front of Logan. Ranger lay at his feet, tail thumping lightly against the floor. Logan shook his head. "Not a ghost, just something that doesn't sit right." He described briefly what he had seen, the frail little girl, the bruise, the silence that carried more weight than words. Mabel's brow furrowed, her kind eyes darkening. "That'd be Howard's girl, wouldn't it? Poor thing. Folks around here whisper he's too hard on her. Always has been, but no one wants to cross him." Logan leaned back, arms folded, his gaze distant. Sometimes, whispers aren't enough. Ranger lifted his head, amber eyes watching his partner, as though he understood the weight of the words. Outside, the wind howled through Pine Brook's narrow streets, rattling shutters and sending the last brittle leaves skittering down the sidewalks. In one house, a little girl curled beneath a patchwork quilt, clutching the warmth of a fleeting smile she had shared with a dog who seemed to see her pain. In another, an officer sat in a quiet diner, troubled by the memory of blue eyes that carried too much silence. And somewhere between them, the threads of fate began to weave tighter, pulling them inexorably toward the moment when neither could look away. The following day in Pine Brook dawned with a weak sun that did little to ease the biting wind. Frost glazed the ground, and thin patches of ice lingered along the edges of the sidewalks, where boots crunched noisily against the frozen earth. In the Briggs house, Clara May moved slowly through the morning routine, her head pounding with each movement. She had learned to hide the pain by pressing her lips together and keeping her hands steady, but every step felt heavier than the last. Howard Briggs left early for the mill, his flannel collar turned up against the cold, while Ethan boasted about his upcoming soccer match, his laughter echoing through the small kitchen. Clara stayed quiet, as she always did. By afternoon, the cold had sharpened, the kind that stung through wool and rattled bones. Clara carried another basket of laundry to the backyard, her small arms straining against the weight, her breath puffed white in the air, the thin sweater doing little to protect her from the chill. She clipped clothes on the line, her fingers stiff with cold, her vision blurring each time she bent forward. From the porch, Ethan idly kicked a soccer ball against the railing, the hollow thuds mocking her unsteady rhythm. He called out, "Don't drop anything this time," his grin wide and careless. Clara ignored him, blinking against the dizziness that made the world tilt like a carousel spinning too fast. On the street corner, a figure lingered. Old Mr. Jonas Keating, a retired carpenter in his 70s, was walking his beagle, Daisy. Jonas was thin as a rail, his back curved from decades bent over wood, his face weathered with deep creases and a nose crooked from an accident long ago. His pale blue eyes, however, still carried a sharpness that belied his age. He paused when he noticed the little girl struggling, his brows furrowing beneath his wool cap. Jonas had lived alone since his wife passed and often filled his days wandering the neighborhood with Daisy. He muttered under his breath, "That child doesn't look right." Daisy, tail wagging, gave a bark that echoed faintly. At that moment, Clara's knees buckled, the basket tipped, spilling damp clothes into the frost-bitten dirt. She collapsed onto the grass, clutching her head, her small body curling inward, as though to shield herself from the brightness of the sky. Ethan froze, his grin faltering, then quickly crossed his arms, pretending indifference, though his eyes darted nervously toward the street. Across the road, Officer Logan Carter's patrol car turned the corner, Ranger sitting alert in the back seat. The German shepherd's ears pricked sharply, his body stiffening as he caught sight of the collapsed figure. He let out a deep bark that reverberated across the yard, his amber eyes locked on Clara. Logan's hands tightened on the wheel, his heart lurching. He braked hard, gravel crunching under his tires, and was out of the car in seconds. "Ranger, heel!" he commanded, though the dog strained forward, a low growl rumbling in his chest, as if the urgency could not be contained. Logan crossed the street quickly, his heavy boots biting into the frost. Ranger padded at his side, muscles tense, gaze unwavering. Clara lay crumpled beside the overturned basket, her hair spilling loose across her pale face. Logan crouched down, his broad frame casting a protective shadow over her. "Clara," he said softly, his voice steady and low. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, her lips parted, but no words came. Ranger pressed close, nudging her arm with his muzzle, whining softly as though urging her back to strength. From the porch, Ethan shouted, "She's fine! She always pretends something's wrong!" His voice cracked with a nervous edge he tried to hide. Logan shot him a glance, his hazel eyes narrowing with the weight of suspicion. Just then, the roar of a pickup truck filled the driveway. Howard Briggs climbed out, his tall frame looming, his jaw clenched as his pale eyes swept the scene. His boots struck the gravel hard as he strode forward. "What's going on here?" he barked, his voice booming enough to make Clara flinch even in her half-conscious state. Logan rose slowly, steady but unyielding, meeting Howard's glare. "She fainted. I found her on the ground. She's got a serious bruise on her head." Howard let out a short, harsh laugh. "Serious? She's fine. Always pretending something's wrong to get out of chores. She needs to toughen up, not be coddled." His voice carried the conviction of a man who mistook cruelty for discipline. Jonas Keating had stopped at the corner, Daisy tugging at the leash, his sharp eyes narrowed as he observed the exchange. He shook his head, muttering, "Stubborn fool," though he said nothing louder. Logan didn't move, his calm presence unshaken. "Head injuries aren't something to ignore," he said firmly. "She needs rest, maybe even a doctor." Howard's jaw tightened, his broad shoulders squaring as he stepped closer. "She doesn't need a doctor. She needs responsibility. You're wasting your time, officer." Ranger gave a low growl, his hackles rising, the fur along his back bristling. Logan placed a calming hand on the dog's back, but did not break eye contact with Howard. The silence between them stretched heavy, as though the cold air itself froze solid. Finally, Logan exhaled slowly, his voice carrying a warning. "If this gets worse, and I find out nothing was done, there will be consequences." Howard's mouth twitched, but he said nothing. He turned his glare on Clara. "Get up! You've embarrassed yourself enough." Clara struggled to her feet, swaying as her knees wobbled. Ranger whined, pressing closer to her side until Logan gave a soft command, pulling him reluctantly back. As Logan and Ranger returned to the patrol car, Logan looked over his shoulder one last time. Clara's small figure stood beneath the harsh silhouette of her father, the laundry still scattered across the grass. The image etched itself into Logan's mind, refusing to fade. He knew in his bones that something was deeply wrong inside that house, and this would not be the last time his path crossed with the Briggs family. Ranger, from the back seat, gave another soft whine, his amber eyes locked on the house until it disappeared from view. Logan reached over and rested a gloved hand briefly against the dog's shoulder. "I saw it too, boy," he murmured, "and we won't let it go." The Saturday air in Pine Brook carried the weight of celebration and the heaviness of cold. The Briggs' backyard had been dressed in its own humble way, folding chairs borrowed from neighbors, a long wooden table draped with a faded gingham cloth and paper streamers sagging in the frosty wind. The event was in honor of Eleanor Briggs, Howard's mother, who turned 70 that week. Family members trickled in, their boots crunching over frozen grass, voices rising in polite cheer as their breath steamed in the air. Eleanor Briggs, the matriarch, sat in a sturdy oak chair near the back door. She was a short woman with iron-gray hair pinned neatly in curls, her once straight posture softened by age, but her dark eyes still piercing. Eleanor wore a navy dress and a string of pearls her late husband had gifted her decades earlier. Though she was not unkind, she carried the same hardness as her son, believing that discipline built character. A life spent enduring loss and hardship in Pine Brook had only cemented her conviction. Around her moved a small constellation of relatives. There was Uncle Paul, Howard's younger brother, a man in his 50s with thinning hair and a belly grown soft from years behind a desk at the county office. Paul had always envied Howard's physical strength, but admired his work ethic nonetheless. Aunt Lillian, Paul's wife, bustled about the table with trays of deviled eggs, her short frame hidden beneath a bulky green coat, her cheeks ruddy from the cold. She was known for her chatter, quick to gossip, but also quick to offer a hand where needed. Cousins ran underfoot, their laughter mingling with the bark of neighborhood dogs straining against leashes at the fence. Howard stood tall among them, shoulders squared, his flannel shirt freshly pressed, as though hosting gave him a platform to display authority. Ethan wore his soccer jersey proudly, darting between cousins and bragging about his most recent game. His wiry frame moved with restless energy, his grin cocky, soaking up the admiration of relatives. He pointed out the bruise on his knee like a badge of honor, earning claps on the back from uncles who praised his grit. Clara lingered at the edges, her faded pink sweater too thin for the chill, her braids unevenly tied. She hovered quietly, clutching her hands together, her bruise still hidden beneath strands of blonde hair. Howard's sharp commands kept her busy fetching utensils, carrying trays, and keeping the younger cousins from trampling the food table. The weight of the day pressed on her small shoulders, but she said nothing, her lips forming only the smallest of polite responses when spoken to. Neighbors drifted into the yard as well, bringing gifts and dishes. Mrs. Adelaide Turner, the silver-haired widow from 3 houses down, appeared carrying a jar of jam wrapped in cloth. Her face brightened when she saw Clara, and she gave the girl a gentle pat on the shoulder, whispering, "Hold on, sweet one," before moving to greet Eleanor. Mr. Jonas Keating shuffled in slowly, Daisy the beagle tugging at her leash. His sharp eyes lingered on Clara for a moment, but he said nothing, only shaking his head at the stiffness between Howard and his daughter. Inside the kitchen, the centerpiece of the celebration waited. A large vanilla cake, frosted white and decorated with pink roses. Clara was ordered to carry it out when the time came. The cake felt impossibly heavy in her arms as she slid her fingers beneath the platter. Her knees wobbled, the pounding in her head returning with each step. She blinked furiously against the brightness of the afternoon sun as she crossed the threshold. The voices hushed, all eyes turning toward her. Just a few more steps, she thought. Set it down, and it will be over. But the world tilted again, spinning cruelly. The cake slipped from her trembling hands, tumbling forward onto the frozen grass. The pink roses smeared in tragic streaks across the ground. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Clara's knees buckled, and she collapsed beside the ruined dessert, her thin frame folding in defeat. For a moment, silence ruled the yard. Then came Ethan's laughter, sharp and unkind. "She ruined it. She can't even carry a cake." He doubled over, his brown eyes sparkling with cruel delight. Several cousins giggled nervously, glancing between Howard and the fallen child. Howard's face darkened, his jaw clenched as he strode forward, his boots striking the earth like hammers. "Clara May, get up!" his voice boomed, echoing across the frozen yard. "Enough of this nonsense. You've embarrassed yourself enough today." Before he could reach her, a sound split the air, low, furious, unmistakable. Ranger. From across the yard, the German shepherd had lunged forward, his powerful chest rippling with muscle as he bounded between Clara and her father. His hackles rose, his teeth bared, a deep growl reverberating in his throat. The crowd gasped, some stepping back in fear, but none mistook the intent. Ranger's amber eyes blazed with purpose as he planted himself firmly over Clara's fragile body, his tail stiff, his stance immovable. Officer Logan Carter was close behind, having arrived through the back gate at the invitation of Adelaide Turner, who had thought his presence might ease tensions at the party. Logan's tall frame cut through the gathering, his navy uniform sharp against the muted colors of the yard. His hazel eyes swept the scene quickly. Clara pale and collapsed, Ranger growling protectively, Howard looming with clenched fists. "Easy, boy," Logan said calmly, his voice a steady anchor as he placed a hand on Ranger's shoulder. The dog's growl lowered, but his body remained tense, chest heaving with protective energy. Logan knelt beside Clara, brushing back her hair to reveal the swollen bruise at her temple. His jaw tightened. "This girl is not fine," he declared loudly enough for everyone to hear. "She's injured, and she needs help now." Howard's mouth twisted, his hands fisting at his sides. "She's putting on a show," he snapped. "She does this all the time to get attention." Logan straightened slowly, his presence radiating authority. His eyes locked on Howard's with an unflinching calm. "Robert," he said, his voice even but carrying iron, "I will not stand here and watch you ignore this. She could have a concussion. If you don't care, I'll make the call myself." The yard fell silent. Eleanor shifted in her chair, her sharp eyes narrowing in discomfort. Neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. Howard opened his mouth to protest, but Logan lifted a single hand, the gesture commanding silence. "Enough!" He turned back to Clara, softening his tone. "Sweetheart, can you hear me? Stay still. You're safe." Clara stirred faintly, her lips moving, though no sound came. Ranger lowered his head, brushing his muzzle against her arm, as though to remind her she was not alone. Then, faint in the distance, came the rising wail of sirens. The crowd parted as the ambulance pulled into the driveway, the flashing lights casting harsh red and white across the frozen yard. Neighbors stepped aside as Logan raised his arm to guide the paramedics through. His broad shoulders blocked the chaos. His calm voice steadied those around him. Clara lay limp in his arms as he carried her toward the stretcher. She felt impossibly light, far too fragile for her 7 years. Ranger trotted close, refusing to leave her side, his amber eyes sharp as if daring anyone to separate them. For the first time in years, Howard Briggs found himself silenced, not by respect or authority of his own, but by the immovable presence of a man, a dog, and a truth that could no longer be ignored. The ambulance rattled through Pine Brook's narrow streets, its siren a piercing wail that bounced off brick facades and startled dogs from porches. Inside, Clara May lay on a stretcher, her face pale beneath wisps of blonde hair, lips murmuring faint words no one could decipher. Ranger crouched near the door, muscles coiled, amber eyes fixed on her fragile body, as though his very gaze could keep her tethered to the world. Officer Logan Carter sat opposite, his broad shoulders tense, his gloved hands resting on his knees. His hazel eyes never left Clara. He had seen battlefield wounds and emergencies in foreign deserts, but something about the quiet suffering of a child tore more deeply than any memory. The paramedics worked quickly. Martin Ellis, early 40s, lean with sharp features and rectangular glasses that slipped down his nose, checked Clara's pupils with a flashlight. His sandy hair, streaked with gray at the temples, gave him a severe air. Martin had once been an ER physician before moving to field response, known for his blunt honesty and steady precision. "Moderate to severe concussion," he said, his voice clipped. "This isn't fresh. It's been days. If it had gone longer, we'd be looking at permanent damage." Beside him worked Janet Myers, younger, late 20s, with auburn hair tucked in a bun beneath her cap. Her pale skin was dotted with freckles, her green eyes soft with empathy. Janet was known among colleagues for her warmth, often humming softly to calm, frightened patients. She stroked Clara's hair gently, speaking in a voice that seemed to melt the chaos around them. "You're safe now, sweetheart. We've got you." At Pine Brook Regional Hospital, the doors swung open and the stretcher wheeled briskly through whitewashed hallways. The antiseptic smell mixed with the rhythmic beeping of machines. Logan followed closely, Ranger pacing at his side, his claws clicking against the tile, drawing curious glances from staff and visitors. The German shepherd walked like a sentinel, ears forward, muscles taut, refusing to be separated from the girl he had chosen to protect. In the examination room, fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. Nurses moved with swift efficiency, one inserting an IV line, another prepping equipment for scans. Clara stirred faintly, her lashes fluttering, a weak groan slipping past her lips. Martin's voice remained firm as he called instructions. "We need CT imaging. Watch for swelling. Keep her head elevated." Janet adjusted the blanket, her green eyes softening when Clara's small hand reached blindly outward. Without hesitation, Ranger pressed closer, slipping his head against her fingers. A faint smile tugged at Clara's lips for the first time in days. In the waiting area, Howard Briggs paced like a caged bear, his broad shoulders hunched, his jaw set in a grim line. His pride had been publicly bruised at the birthday gathering, and humiliation still burned beneath his skin. Ethan slouched in a chair nearby, his wiry frame tense, his brown eyes flashing irritation. He muttered, "Everyone's making a fuss. She's just being dramatic. She always ruins things." His words faltered, however, under the stares of neighbors who had followed from the party. Some whispered, others shook their heads. The once private cruelty of the Briggs home had been dragged into the open. Officer Logan stood apart, arms folded, his navy uniform crisp beneath the harsh lights. His gaze was steady, his stance immovable. The discipline of the Marines still lingered in his bearing, but now it was married with a conviction forged by years of protecting those who could not protect themselves. He had already spoken to hospital staff, ensuring a full report would be filed. He knew too well what happened when silence replaced accountability. Time passed in anxious stillness until Dr. Ellis emerged from the examination room, peeling off gloves. His face carried the calm severity of a man accustomed to emergencies, but frustration lingered in his eyes. "She's stable, but she suffered a significant concussion. The swelling tells me it's been untreated for days. If this had gone any longer..." He let the words trail, heavy as iron. His gaze shifted pointedly toward Howard. This was neglect, plain and simple. Howard's face flushed crimson, his fists tightening at his sides. "She never said how bad it was. Kids bump their heads all the time." Martin adjusted his glasses with a sharp motion. "Number? This isn't a bump. This is trauma left to worsen. She's lucky she collapsed when she did." Ethan opened his mouth to sneer. "She gets all this attention just for falling." But his words died under Logan's steady stare. The officer's hazel eyes, calm yet piercing, held more authority than raised voices. "Head trauma is not about attention," Logan said quietly. "It's about survival." Janet appeared behind Martin, her freckled face soft but firm. "She'll need monitoring for several days, and care. Gentle, patient care." Her green eyes flicked toward Howard, unimpressed by his looming frame. For a moment, silence held the hallway. Back in the room, Clara lay beneath a white blanket, her blue eyes fluttering open to the sterile glow above. She turned her head slightly, wincing, but when her gaze landed on Ranger, seated like a sphinx at the door, her lips curved into a faint smile. She stretched her small hand toward him, and Ranger moved closer, laying his head against the edge of her bed. His amber eyes never wavered, unblinking in his watchfulness. Nurses passing by paused, their steps slowing as they caught the sight. One elderly woman whispered, "Like an angel, guarding her." A young orderly smiled faintly, shaking his head in quiet awe. Even hardened staff felt the ripple of something rare, the raw loyalty of a creature who refused to leave her side. Logan lingered by the window, his broad chest rising and falling with quiet resolve. He had seen loyalty before, among Marines who laid down lives for one another, but Ranger's devotion to this fragile child stirred something deeper, something almost sacred. He knew with certainty that this bond would not break. The sterile hospital room carried more warmth than Clara's home had in years. For the first time in her young life, she felt not only treated, but cared for, compassion brushing against her like sunlight through frosted glass. As she drifted into safer sleep, her fingers still twined loosely into Ranger's fur. The room seemed less harsh, the night less cold. And outside in the waiting hall, Logan Carter's resolve hardened. This was no longer just about duty. It was about justice. The pale November sun spilled through the hospital windows, casting long shafts of light across the sterile floor. Machines beeped rhythmically beside Clara's bed, a steady reminder that she was being monitored, watched, cared for. Her thin frame was nearly lost beneath the white blanket, her face still marked by the deep bruise on her temple. Yet she looked calmer than she had in days, her hand resting against Ranger's thick fur as he sat by her side like a statue carved of loyalty and muscle. Logan Carter stood near the door, his tall frame leaning slightly against the wall. He had spent years in places where children went unnoticed, where cries were lost in the noise of war. Standing here now, in this small hospital room, he felt something shift inside him. He had promised himself long ago never to grow numb to injustice, and Clara May Briggs was injustice in flesh and blood. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway, breaking the stillness. A woman appeared in the doorway, her breath uneven as if she had run the last few steps. She was in her early 40s, tall and slender, her auburn hair falling in loose waves around a face lined with both laughter and grief. Her hazel eyes, though shadowed with years of regret, burned with fierce determination. She wore a simple gray cardigan over dark jeans, her figure graceful but unadorned, practical. This was Martha Collins, Clara's maternal aunt. She had lived 2 states away since her sister, Clara's mother, had died nearly 5 years ago. Guilt had gnawed at her all those years. Guilt that distance had kept her from the children when they needed her most. Now, seeing Clara pale and fragile in the bed, that guilt bloomed into something heavier. Resolve. "Aunt Martha?" Clara's voice was weak, hoarse, but filled with recognition. The small girl's lips trembled before she whispered again. "Auntie!" Martha rushed forward, kneeling at the side of the bed. She brushed back Clara's hair with trembling fingers, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I should have been here sooner," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I'm here now, and I won't leave you again." Clara's hand clutched her aunt's sleeve, and silent tears streamed down her face, tears that had been swallowed for too many nights. Martha gathered her gently, mindful of the IV lines, her own tears slipping free. Ranger leaned forward, brushing his muzzle against Clara's arm, his amber eyes shifting briefly to Martha, as though assessing her intent. When her gaze met his, steady and unwavering, something like trust passed between them. Logan stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Mrs. Collins, I'm Officer Carter. Clara collapsed yesterday. She's been diagnosed with a concussion, moderate to severe. The doctors say it's been left untreated for days. I've filed a report with Child Protective Services. There will be a hearing." Martha rose slowly, squaring her slender shoulders. "You mean to tell me my niece has been hurt like this, and no one did a thing?" Her hazel eyes flashed with fire, though the grief beneath her voice betrayed the depth of her regret. Logan shook his head. "Not anymore. But you should prepare. There'll be custody proceedings. Her father, he won't give up control easily." In the waiting room, Howard Briggs sat stiffly, his broad frame hunched forward, fists clenched at his sides. His pale eyes flicked toward Martha when she emerged from Clara's room, his lips curling into a hard sneer. "You don't belong here. These are my kids." Martha faced him squarely, her figure slender but unshaken. "Your kids? Look at her, Howard. She's lying in a hospital bed because you decided toughness was more important than love. I lost my sister to an early grave, and I won't lose Clara too." Howard's nostrils flared. Ethan, sitting beside him, looked between the 2 adults, his wiry frame taut with confusion. For the first time, doubt flickered in his brown eyes, though resentment quickly replaced it. "She makes us all look bad," Ethan muttered. Logan moved between them, his tall frame commanding space without effort. "This isn't the place," he said quietly, his hazel eyes sharp. "But understand this, Howard. It's not your word against hers anymore. The law will decide, and the law has eyes on you." Howard's jaw worked, but he said nothing further, choosing instead to pace the hallway like a man caged. Martha turned back toward the room, her hands trembling, but her chin lifted. She returned to Clara's bedside, brushing away a strand of blonde hair. "Sweetheart, you don't have to be afraid anymore," she whispered. "You've been far too brave for someone your age. But from now on, you won't face it alone. I'll fight for you." At the foot of the bed, Ranger shifted into a sphinx-like posture, his ears pricked, amber eyes scanning the hall and then returning to the child. His entire stance seemed to echo Martha's vow: no one will hurt her again. That evening, as the sun slipped below the horizon and the hospital lights glowed against the falling dusk, Logan entered the room with a file tucked under his arm. His square jaw was set with quiet resolve. "It's official," he said, his voice steady. "Howard Briggs is under investigation for neglect. There will be custody hearings soon. The hospital's report and mine will both stand in Clara's favor." Martha's hazel eyes filled with tears, her lips curving into a faint, tired smile. "Thank you, Officer Carter." Logan glanced toward Ranger, who stirred at Clara's side, tail brushing softly against the sheets. "Don't thank me," he said quietly. "Thank him. He's the one who sounded the alarm when no one else did." Clara's small hand reached for Ranger again. "My Rex," she whispered, her voice faint but tinged with awe. Ranger's amber eyes softened, his head lowering to the bed, a silent vow in the stillness. And in that hospital room, bathed in sterile light but filled with warmth, 3 threads of fate twined together: a child who had finally been seen, a dog who refused to leave her side, and an aunt who had come to fight for what was right. The courthouse in Pinebrook loomed with a stern dignity, its red brick walls weathered by decades of rain and sun. On that crisp winter morning, sunlight spilled through tall, arched windows, casting patterns across the marble steps, where townsfolk gathered in murmuring clusters. Word had spread quickly. Howard Briggs was facing investigation, and his daughter's future would be decided here. Neighbors, curious and restless, crowded near the entrance, their breath steaming in the cold air. Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of polish and paper. The wooden benches creaked as people settled, their hushed whispers bouncing beneath the high ceiling. At the front sat Judge Harold Whitaker, a man in his late 60s with a lean frame draped in a black robe. His hair, once dark, was now almost entirely white, combed neatly back, and his square jaw had softened with age. Yet his eyes, pale blue and unyielding, carried the memory of a childhood scarred by an abusive father. Those who knew him understood. When it came to cases involving children, Whitaker's judgment struck like iron. Howard Briggs sat at the defendant's table, his broad shoulders filling the worn wooden chair. His flannel shirt and jeans looked casual, but his posture was rigid, his jaw set in defiance. Ethan sat beside him, smaller in comparison, his brown hair hanging into his eyes. He fidgeted constantly, bouncing his foot, his wiry frame betraying unease. Though he had always basked in his father's shadow, today that shadow felt less like protection and more like a cage. Across the aisle sat Martha Collins, tall and slender in a navy blouse that gave her presence a quiet strength. Her auburn hair framed a face resolute with purpose, though grief lingered in the creases at the corners of her hazel eyes. Clara sat close beside her, dressed in a pale yellow dress chosen by her aunt. Her blonde hair was brushed neatly, tied with a ribbon, though the faint purple shadow of the bruise on her temple had not yet faded. She clutched a small handkerchief in one hand, the other resting in Ranger's thick fur. The German shepherd sat tall, his black and silver coat gleaming in the filtered light, his amber eyes sweeping the room with steady vigilance. Officer Logan Carter stood near the witness stand, his navy uniform immaculate. The sharp lines of his jaw, shaded with dark stubble, framed a face set with calm authority. He had already testified in preliminary hearings, but today he was here to present everything, every detail of what he had witnessed. His presence filled the room, not with volume, but with quiet certainty. Judge Whitaker raised his gavel once, the sharp crack silencing the whispers. "This court is now in session." His voice carried the weight of both authority and memory, filling the room with expectation. The county's prosecutor, Margaret Holloway, rose first. Margaret was in her mid-50s, a tall woman with broad shoulders and silver-streaked hair pinned into a bun. Her face was angular, her gray eyes sharp with intelligence. Known for her tenacity, she had spent decades fighting cases where the vulnerable needed a voice. Life had not been kind to her. She had raised 2 children alone after a bitter divorce, but the hardship had only sharpened her resolve. She stepped forward, her voice steady. "Your Honor, this case is about a child, 7 years old, who suffered a concussion that went untreated for days. Witnesses confirm neglect. Medical evidence confirms injury. What we are here to decide is simple: whether Clara May Briggs deserves safety or whether she remains in the custody of a man who dismissed her pain as weakness. Howard's attorney, Gerald Finn, a balding man in his 50s with a rounded frame and nervous mannerisms, shuffled his papers before standing. His suit was too large at the shoulders, and his watery eyes flicked nervously toward Howard. "Your Honor," he began, "children fall, they bruise, they cry. Mr. Briggs is a hard-working man, respected in this town, who believes in raising his children with discipline. To call this neglect is an exaggeration." Judge Whitaker's pale eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing, motioning for the first witness. Logan Carter took the stand, his tall frame commanding attention even as he sat. His hazel eyes met the judge's without hesitation. In calm, measured tones, he described what he had seen: the faint bruise when he first met Clara by the laundry line, her collapse days later, Howard's dismissals, the birthday gathering where she fainted carrying the cake, and Ranger's protective stance. "Did you believe," Margaret asked, "that Clara was in immediate danger if no intervention occurred?" "Yes," Logan replied simply, his voice steady. "I've seen men ignore injuries, call them weakness. But this was a child, untreated and silenced. If we hadn't stepped in, the consequences could have been permanent." Margaret nodded, satisfied, before turning to the judge. Logan's testimony carried no embellishment, only the calm authority of truth. Howard's attorney attempted to shake him. "Officer Carter, isn't it possible she exaggerated her symptoms?" Logan's hazel eyes sharpened. "Children don't exaggerate concussions. They survive them. There's a difference." His words cut through the courtroom like steel. When the doctor, Martin Ellis, testified, his sharp features betrayed his frustration. The swelling proved this injury was several days old. If left untreated, it could have caused permanent brain damage. This was no accident brushed off. This was neglect. Finally, Martha took the stand. Her tall figure seemed fragile under the weight of memory, but her hazel eyes blazed with conviction. "I lost my sister, Clara's mother, 5 years ago. I wasn't there then, and I'll carry that guilt forever. But I am, here now. Clara deserves a life free from fear, where she can laugh, play, and grow without trembling under her father's shadow." Her voice trembled but did not break. Howard rose briefly when called to speak. His square jaw was tight, his pale eyes flashing with stubbornness. "I raise my children the way my father raised me. Kids toughen up when they fall. The world doesn't hand out sympathy. They'll learn that one day." The courtroom stirred with murmurs. One neighbor shook his head, whispering, "He hasn't learned a thing." Judge Whitaker lifted his gavel, the sharp crack silencing the noise. His voice was low, steady, but carried the fire of personal memory. "Mr. Briggs, what you call toughening, this court calls neglect, and it nearly cost your daughter her life." He turned toward Martha, his expression softening. "Mrs. Collins, the court finds you fit and proper to serve as Clara May Briggs's guardian. Full custody is hereby granted, effective immediately." For a moment, silence hung heavy. Clara's breath caught, her blue eyes widening as she looked up at her aunt. Martha bent low, tears glistening in her hazel eyes. "It's official, sweetheart. You're coming home with me." Howard slammed his fist against the table, but the bailiff, a tall, broad-shouldered man in uniform named Frank Morrison, stepped forward with a warning glance. Frank was in his 40s, a man with a weathered face and steady hands, respected for his even temperament. His presence was enough to make Howard sit back down. Ethan turned his face away, lips pressed tight, confusion clouding his young features. Outside, the winter sky stretched wide and brilliant, unmarred by clouds. On the courthouse steps, Clara clutched Ranger tightly, burying her face in his fur. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but this time they were not of fear. They were of release. Logan crouched slightly to meet her gaze, his large hand resting gently on her small shoulder. His hazel eyes softened. "You're safe now, Clara. From this day on, you're safe." She nodded, turning her gaze upward toward the endless sky. For the first time, the future seemed possible, painted not in fear, but in hope. Winter loosened its grip on Pine Brook slowly, the snowbanks shrinking into rivulets that trickled along the gutters, and the air carrying a softer edge. A week had passed since the gavel struck in Judge Whitaker's courtroom, and Clara May Briggs's world had changed forever. No longer did she tread quietly in her father's house, flinching at every voice. Now she stood on the worn wooden porch of her aunt's home, clutching Ranger's fur as the dog's warm body pressed protectively against her side. Martha Collins' house sat on the outskirts of Pine Brook, a white clapboard home with blue shutters and a wraparound porch that creaked underfoot. It wasn't grand, but it radiated welcome. The yard, though still covered in patches of stubborn snow, showed signs of Martha's care. Bird feeders hung from branches, wind chimes tinkled in the breeze, and a small vegetable patch lay dormant under a blanket of frost. The house itself smelled faintly of lavender and fresh bread, and for Clara, stepping through the door was like stepping into a place she had long dreamed of. Martha moved easily through her kitchen, her tall frame graceful despite the quickness of her motions. She wore her auburn hair tied back loosely. Sleeves rolled above her wrists as she kneaded dough for dinner rolls. Years of raising her sister's children from a distance had left her with a heavy heart, but now she was determined to make up for lost time. "Clara," she said warmly, glancing over her shoulder, "why don't you set the table? We'll eat soon." Clara nodded, her small hands eager for the task. She placed plates carefully on the table, smoothing the cloth beneath each one. Her blue eyes still carried the shadows of past fear, but in this house they sparked now and again with a timid light. Ranger followed her steps faithfully, his amber gaze scanning each corner of the room, as if still convinced danger might slip through unseen cracks. That afternoon, Logan Carter stopped by in his patrol car, parking by the gate. He stepped from the vehicle, tall and broad-shouldered, his navy coat buttoned against the lingering chill. In his hand, he carried a box wrapped in brown paper. Martha greeted him at the porch, her hazel eyes warm but serious. "Officer Carter," she said, "I wasn't expecting you today." "Just Logan," he corrected gently, offering the package. "Something for Clara." From a neighbor inside the box was a small patchwork doll, stitched together from scraps of cloth. Mrs. Adelaide Turner, the widow from down the street, had made it herself, sewing late into the night. The doll's mismatched button eyes and crooked smile gave it charm. Clara hugged it close, her small frame trembling with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. Logan crouched slightly, his hazel eyes soft. "You deserve kindness, Clara. Don't forget that." Over the next days, life settled into a fragile rhythm. Clara attended school again, though tentatively, her bruise still fading into a pale shadow. At Pine Brook Elementary, her teacher, Miss Lydia Barnes, took her gently under wing. Miss Barnes was a woman in her 30s, tall and slender, her brown hair always pinned neatly into a bun. She wore spectacles that framed kind green eyes, and her voice carried both authority and tenderness. Having grown up in foster care herself, Lydia understood what it meant to feel unseen, and she quietly resolved to help Clara find her footing. On Clara's first day back, Lydia crouched beside her desk. "If you feel dizzy, sweetheart, you raise your hand. We'll take it slow, all right?" Clara nodded, clutching her pencil tightly. Ranger, granted special permission by the principal due to his service training, sat at the back of the classroom, drawing curious stares from other children. His presence alone seemed to anchor Clara, giving her the courage to whisper answers when called upon. Ethan, meanwhile, struggled in the weeks after the trial. Though he still lived with Howard, the boy had begun to feel the cracks in his father's authority. At soccer practice, his teammates whispered about what had happened in a court. No longer was he the golden boy untouchable in his father's pride. His wiry frame grew tense, his laughter hollow. For the first time, Ethan began to wonder whether loyalty to his father had cost him something he couldn't name. One evening, as Martha tucked Clara into bed beneath a quilt stitched years before by Clara's mother, the girl whispered, "Will Daddy be mad forever?" Martha brushed back her niece's hair gently. "Maybe, sweetheart, but that's not your burden to carry anymore. You're safe now. You don't need his approval to know your worth." Clara's lips trembled, but she nodded slowly, clutching the doll Adelaide had made. Ranger leapt onto the rug at the foot of her bed, curling into a tight, watchful coil. His black and silver coat gleamed in the lamplight, and his steady breathing filled the room. To Clara, he was more than a guardian. He was proof that love could be constant, silent, and unwavering. Logan visited often, sometimes on duty, sometimes off. He helped fix Martha's fence one Saturday, his broad frame steady as he hammered new boards into place. Martha watched from the porch, her hazel eyes softening at the sight of Clara giggling as she handed nails to Logan, Ranger circling them with a protective bark whenever a stranger walked by. There was no question anymore. This was a new family forming, bound not by blood alone, but by choice and by love. One Sunday morning, the bells of Pine Brook's small chapel rang across the town. Martha, Clara, Logan, and Ranger walked up the stone steps together. Inside, the pews were filled with neighbors who had watched the trial unfold, their eyes softening as they saw Clara safe among her new guardians. Pastor Raymond Hill, a stout man in his 50s with thinning hair and kind brown eyes, preached about second chances and the quiet miracles that often came not with thunder, but with the steady presence of love. Clara clutched Martha's hand tightly, her lips forming a shy smile as Ranger pressed against her knee. When they returned home that afternoon, Clara curled on the porch swing beside Martha, her blonde head resting against her aunt's arm. "Is this what family feels like?" she asked softly. Martha kissed the crown of her hair. "Yes, darling, this is family, and it's yours now." As twilight fell, Logan stood at the gate, Ranger beside him. The German shepherd's amber eyes caught the last light of day, his ears forward, his chest rising with a quiet strength. Clara ran down the steps and wrapped her arms around his neck, whispering, "My Rex." The dog's tail swept against the ground, a silent vow renewed. For the first time in her short life, Clara looked toward tomorrow, not with dread, but with hope. And in Pine Brook, under the fading winter sky, a story of loss had finally become a story of rebirth. In the end, Clara's story is more than just a tale of hardship and rescue. It is a reminder that God still works miracles in our world, sometimes through the steady paw of a loyal dog, sometimes through the courage of a caring soul who refuses to look away. In our daily lives, it may not be as dramatic as a courtroom or a hospital room, but each of us has the chance to be someone's miracle, a kind word, a helping hand, a moment of love that can change a life. If this story touched your heart, please share it with a friend, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe so we can keep spreading hope together. And if you believe that God's blessings still move among us, protecting the weak and guiding the lost, write amen in the comments. May the Lord bless you and your family today and always.